Hi, again, my name is Tom Cooke. Thank you for coming this morning. We're here for a presentation on the Freedom of Information Act, which is in fact the backdrop for everything that public employees do. Every email we write, every document we send is at least a candidate for discovery through the Freedom of Information Act. It is a very good thing in that it guarantees transparency of government, and I think we can all support that. It can also be a very tricky thing. There are times when confidentiality of information does take precedence, and knowing when to ask the questions is probably the most important thing out of all this. We're very fortunate today to have Tom Hennick here. He is on my speed dial back in the office. I speak to him on a regular basis. I mean, usually it's 3 or 4 times a month that I have a call into Tom. And the great news is that he is very responsive, very helpful. He knows the law inside and out, and he regularly works with both complainants and town staff to make sure that reasonable solutions are found to FOI concerns. He's a master at these presentations. We're very, very lucky to have him. He will be joined in a bit by our town council, Bob DiCrescenzo, who is the other person that I contact when I have FOI issues. So please welcome Tom Hennick.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
That's too much of a buildup. We'll hope we can meet the standards. Thank you for inviting me out here today. We do these sessions all over the state, morning, afternoon, evening. You want us, we come. And the fact that you called us and asked us to come is always a good thing, because it means you're trying to follow freedom of information and do things the right way. When I do these little talks, I always like to tell people a little bit about myself. Tom mentioned that Attorney DiCrescenzo will be joining us later. I need to tell you that I'm not an attorney. Now, I know, is that good news or bad news? I'm not sure. But the reason I share that with you is that the goal today is not to necessarily give you any binding legal opinions. In fact, I can't do that. The goal is to give you some plain language information about freedom of information, to give you the tools to work with, to teach, to try to help you. So one of the things I'd suggest is, as we go along, as we get into some of the nuts and bolts, that if you have questions as we're going along, just ask them. Raise your hand, we'll stop. It's best if we answer the questions, or try to answer the questions as we go along. In addition to telling you that I'm not an attorney, in the interest of full disclosure, before I joined Freedom of Information, I was a journalist. I don't know if that's good news or bad news. I don't know how that plays. But the reason I throw that out there is it sort of gives me a well-rounded idea as to what's coming down the road. I spend most of my time on the phone at Freedom of Information answering questions, or at the computer answering emails questions, and a lot of times I can anticipate what the question is going to be, because I was often on the other side for 25 years. So I kind of get that. And the third thing that sort of helps me kind of analyze and interpret and help folks out on both sides is that I know most of you are staff, but a lot of you have to deal with your volunteer board members, don't you? And you'll get this. You'll say, well, we're just volunteers. We don't get this FOI stuff, and we don't know how to deal with that. And when I go out and do these sessions at night, I was in Orange 2 nights ago, and that was the first thing they said. But we're volunteers. We don't understand this. Well, it goes with the territory, but I also understand it. For 10 years, I was a member of a board in the town where I live. I was the chairman for 5. So I understand what it's like to do your real job during the day and then volunteer. And you think, gee, I'm just doing this to give back. And a lot of times you get back. People are unhappy. They're yelling there. So I get that as well. But the thing to impart, the knowledge to impart to your board folks when they come to you, is that this is part of the deal. You run for office to be on a board, or you're appointed to a board, you have to understand that freedom of information goes with it. It's the law in the state of Connecticut. It's a law that's 39 years old. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. And if you do the math, 39 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. And if you remember the mood of the country at the time, there was incredible distrust of government. And Ella was one of those who did not trust her government. I'm told by those who knew her and interviewed her back then that she was really upset by what she saw. She was in Congress when Watergate exploded all around us, and she was contemplating this run for governor, and she said, we can't have this. secret government, government behind closed doors, it doesn't work. So she came back to run for governor, and she said, we're going to have some sort of an open government law. In fact, she made it one of the primary planks in her first campaign platform. We're going to have an open government law. And then she got elected, and she said, I'm still with it. She didn't drop that idea, and she made it one of the first things that she did. And she said, it is so important to our future that it will be approved unanimously by the legislature. Now, I know we have a legislator in the audience. Can you imagine guaranteeing that? Can you imagine guaranteeing that? Can you imagine saying this is what we're going to do? Well, she did it. She guaranteed it, and she got it. I've actually watched the video, and there wasn't a single no vote. Now, again, if you've watched the legislature in action, you know that that's almost an impossible task. There had to be a lot of discussion, a lot of negotiation, a lot of maybe, I like this, you like that. So to get to that point, we've created a law that, while it is based on a simple concept, has a lot of gray area in it. And Tom mentioned that it can be tricky. And the gray areas lead to sort of putting those of you who are on the front line on the spot frequently. You have to be able to interpret the law. Gee, is this a record we should give out? Is this a meeting that should be an executive session? And sometimes you have to sort of sort things through, and it's not intuitive all the time. It doesn't exactly follow the course that you think it should. So the idea of a session like this is to try to help you sort some of those misperceptions or some of the fuzzy areas out, so that when you go forward and you have an issue with freedom of information, you can deal with it. It's based on a simple concept. I always share this quote. This is James Madison, mid-1700s. A popular government without popular information is the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. A people who mean to be their own governor must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. For democracy to work, people need to know what's going on. They can't operate in a vacuum. They have to be able to know what the budget numbers are. They have to be able to know how boards are leaning, what a building project, how much it's going to cost before they go and vote. So the idea is to make sure that government is open and accessible, to make sure that people can see what's going on, and that's what this law is designed to do. It's called freedom of information, but it's not really about free information. I'll bet some of you, especially those of you who are staffers, have had a situation where people walk in and they say, I demand to know it under freedom of information. Well, technically, the law doesn't require you to answer a question. It's about access to the documents that have that information, access to the meetings where this information is sort of put together. So you have to sort of, that's kind of one of the first things that you have to explain to people, that it's not necessarily about answering your questions. It's about making sure that the information is available in the records that you have. Now, people see freedom of information. They see our name. Good morning. And they say, wait a minute, you're the Freedom of Information Commission. I can go to you and get any question answered. They view us as the information kiosk for the state of Connecticut. You would be stunned at some of the questions that we get. You wouldn't believe. People call up from all over the country, sometimes all over outside of the country. Can you tell me this? Can you tell me that? When I get that sort of a question, I realize they don't understand how the law works. The Freedom of Information Commission was created basically to break ties, to adjudicate. So when someone believes they've been denied access to those records or meetings that we were talking about, they come to us with a complaint. They say, look, we believe that there was an improper decision there. And our commission ultimately makes the ruling. But again, because of the interpretive nature of compliance with this law, our decisions get interpreted too. They can get taken all the way to the state Supreme Court. But they come to us when I hear that question on the other end of the phone that says, I need you to get for me. They have this vision of us sitting in this big vault with every record held by every agency in the state of Connecticut. I got a call a couple weeks ago from a woman who said to me, I need you to get for me. And when I hear that, I know there's a problem. But she says, I want you to tell me and send me all the gun permits that I have. Shouldn't you know how many gun permits you have? You know? I mean, those are the kind of strange questions that come our way. A couple years ago, if you go in and around Hartford, when there's a big play at the Bushnell, there are flags hanging from the light poles. Have you seen those when you go around? So a couple years ago, Mary Poppins was coming to the Bushnell, and I'm at my desk one afternoon and answering questions about open meetings and records and things like that. And Tom, you've got to call, pick up the phone, the woman, desperation in her voice. I'm desperate. I need your help. I said, what's the problem? She said, I need tickets to Mary Poppins. And I said, well, it's not that kind of free information, but I want you to know, as a good public servant, I looked up the number of the Bushnell box office, I gave it to her. I hope she enjoyed the show. But people need to understand that it's not about that kind of free information. It's about access. So it's about access to records and access to meetings. So what I'll do is I'll go through the provisions for the meetings and the provisions for the records a little bit. And again, jump in if you have anything you want to add, and then we'll answer questions at the end if we don't get to them as we go through. When we talk about meetings, I want you to listen to the words of the definition. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. The advice that you should give to your boards. Are there board members in the room? We have a couple lonely souls. Advice to you and to those of you who guide your boards is that any time you're gathering to do your work, you're having a meeting. And you want to make sure you follow some basic steps. You want to make sure the meeting is properly noticed, that it's open to the public, and there are minutes when the meeting is done. A lot of folks who volunteer get into trouble with nomenclature, what we're going to call it. Well, it was just a workshop. We don't need to worry about FOI. Or it was just a little subgroup. We don't need to worry about it. It doesn't matter what you call it. If you've gathered to do your work, you're having a meeting. That workshop issue comes a lot during budget season. Well, we're going to have a budget workshop. We're not going to notice it. That's not what the law says. If you're doing the work of your board, you're having a meeting. Folks say, well, we're just going to form a subcommittee. It's not the full board, so we don't need to worry about freedom of information. This law applies to all public agencies in the state of Connecticut. And I won't read you that definition. It's pretty long. But embedded in that definition is a phrase that says, including any committee of or created by. So if your board creates a subcommittee, by definition, for freedom of information purposes, it becomes a public agency unto itself and needs to follow the same rules. A lot of folks say, well, we didn't have a quorum, so we don't need to worry about FOI. Now, as the former chairman of a board, I wish I could tell you that that were true, because that would have solved a lot of the problems that I had trying to make sure that we followed the law. There is a ruling, an appellate court ruling that says if you do not have a quorum, you don't have a meeting under FOI. There is a ruling that says that. But guess what? There's also an appellate court ruling that says if you don't have a quorum, you could still be having a meeting under FOI. You have appellate court rulings that I call them the dueling rulings. They're diametrically opposed. At one point, the Supreme Court took that up. They were going to sort of give us an answer one way or another. They actually heard oral arguments in the case that was going to decide it, and then they said, well, no, never mind. We decided we're not going to do that. And they left both rules, both standing. So when people call and say we didn't have a quorum so we don't have to worry, I can't give them a straight answer. My advice is always, look, if you go forward and do your work without a quorum, my suggestion is to make sure you followed freedom of information so that at least there's no issue. I took a call yesterday from a woman who was panicked. She said, we didn't realize that we didn't have a quorum. It was kind of an open meeting, and it was a discussion, and we had a speaker, and it wasn't until it was over have we violated the law. And my advice there is, well, you may have something in your charter or your bylaws that said that you shouldn't have done that, but you haven't violated freedom of information if it was properly noticed, and if when it was open, and if the meeting, when it's over, you create minutes that reflect, we did this, we had no quorum, we took no action, and there's a record that you went ahead and met anyway. It doesn't happen a lot, but it's always good to keep in the back of your mind. The law talks to us about three kinds of meetings. It talks to us about the regular meeting, the special meeting, the emergency meeting. Regular meeting is the meeting that you have per a schedule you submit to your town clerk. By the end of January of every year, we meet on the first and third Tuesday, the second and fourth Wednesday, 7 o'clock, library, town hall. That's your regular meeting time and place. The special meeting is a meeting you have when you're not scheduled to meet, but you need to have a meeting. The difference between the two isn't all that great. For both of them, you have to prepare an agenda or a notice. The terms are somewhat interchangeable. That agenda notice has to be available in your office if you have one, and also in your town clerk's office at least 24 hours before the meeting. By the way, if you're in charge of that sort of thing, make sure your agendas are as specific as possible. You want to make sure that the agenda fairly apprises the public as to what's going to happen. Available 24 hours in advance, and for a special meeting, and a special meeting only, that agenda, that notice needs to be on your website as well. Now I got to back up for just a second here. There's a lot of confusion about website responsibilities. And part of this has to do with a well-intentioned law that was passed, but then a lot of towns got upset and it got peeled back. In 2008, the legislature passed a law that said everything goes on websites. All agendas, all notices, all minutes. A lot of towns, especially some of the smaller ones, had a problem with that. We don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the personnel, we can't do it. But the law was in place for about a year and a half. And a lot of towns struggled with it, but started doing it. And found that the more they put on their websites, the better off they were. Because people were sort of drawn to the websites. They were looking there, and so they were getting fewer calls. When's the meeting? Where's the meeting? Where's the agenda? It was right there. It was right there on the website. But in 2010, the legislature changed the law and peeled back the requirement, the legal requirement for towns, for municipalities. So the only requirement left legally is that special meeting notice. If you are putting all your agendas and all your minutes and things on your websites, I would urge you to consider doing that and continuing to do that, because we found anecdotally that it's been very helpful, that it's been people are just a lot better off, and it's less stress on town employees because it's all there. Go look at the website. But legally, the only requirement is that special meeting notice. The other difference between the special and the regular meeting is that at a regular meeting, should something occur that's not on your agenda, you can vote to add it to the agenda by 2/3 of those board members who are present. At a special meeting, you cannot. So when you submit that special meeting notice, when that 24-hour window closes, all you can talk about is what's on that notice. The meetings are fairly similar except for that one provision. The emergency meeting. The emergency meeting is a meeting that I really discourage boards and commissions from using. It's an unnoticed meeting. The first thing I tell people is, look, I know everybody in Simsbury gets along. You don't have any political fighting or anything like that, right? Right? Everybody gets along? It's good, in a great place? But when you have a meeting that's not noticed, what's the first thing that happens? What are they doing? What are they hiding? Why didn't they tell us? It's a natural instinct. In addition to that, from a more practical standpoint, the bar for what constitutes an emergency in the eyes of this law is really high. The law doesn't envision meetings that are not noticed. It doesn't want you to have unnoticed meetings. So what you and I might think is an emergency might not necessarily rise to that level in the eyes of the law and might put you in a difficult situation. Every Tuesday after Martin Luther King's birthday, I will get at least one phone call that goes something like this. Tom, we have our regular meeting tonight, Tuesday night. I always notice that Tuesday meeting on Monday. I forgot we were closed yesterday. So this is an emergency, right? Well, if you take the law out of the picture, you might want to call it an emergency, but the law doesn't say, oops, I forgot, is an emergency. So you want to just be really conscious of that. I'll share a story with you, true story, to show you what might happen in an emergency situation that wasn't, or in a non-notice situation, just to let you know. Over in Ridgefield, the other side of the state, a few years back, a situation where the assistant fire chief thought he was about to become the next chief. He was very happy about that until he found out that he wasn't going to become the next chief. And he got really, really angry. And he had a confrontation with the first selectman that I'm told was one heck of a confrontation. You know, the kinds that you wanted to record and show, screaming, yelling, swearing, cursing. First selectman finally says, look, you can curse at me all afternoon, but you're not going to be the next chief. That's just the way it is. But you're going to be the interim chief until we find somebody. He's mad. He walks away. He says, well, I can live with that. But Ridgefield, like Simsbury, like most of the towns in Connecticut, small town, it doesn't take very long. The phone's ringing off the hook. The emails are coming in. You got to get rid of him. This is terrible. He's insubordinate. First selectman's thinking about it and says, you know, this guy really was out of line. He's a danger. He's a threat. So he decides to have an emergency meeting the next day, which was a Saturday. So Saturday morning, he has an emergency meeting to talk about this guy's conduct. And at the meeting, the Board of Selectmen decides, you know what, this isn't any good. He's fired. He's out. So they send somebody out to find him because he wasn't working. It was a Saturday morning. They go find him. They drag him down to town hall. They bring him in. Thanks for coming in. You're fired. He gets mad all over again. He says, you can't fire me because I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. The guy thinks about it. He says, what was the emergency? Maybe he heard, the FOI. So he says, I don't think there was an emergency. I think that should have been a notice meeting. And he files a complaint with the FOI commission, which is his right. It goes before the commission. The hearing officer hears the information, sorts it through and says, you know what, there was no emergency there. Rules against the town. Goes to the full commission. The full commission agrees. And in the ruling, the commission says, there was no emergency there, and we declare null and void what happened at that meeting. Now, that is one of the stronger things that our commission can do if it believes that there was a particularly egregious meetings violation. So it declares null and void, which means the guy basically was fired and or quit at a meeting that didn't happen. Now, that could have been the end of the story, but then it wouldn't have been a good story. Ridgefield appeals it, and takes it all the way to the state Supreme Court. Remember, I told you, we get interpreted too. We don't always win. But in this case, the state Supreme Court in January of 2010 said, we agree with the FOI Commission. There was no emergency there. We also declare null and void what happened at that meeting. We're standing here in May of 2014, and I tell you that within the last 3 weeks, they finally put this matter to bed in Ridgefield because a judge pushed them to a settlement, said, you've got to settle this. They made a payment to this guy, and I guess the matter is finally closed. Now, we're talking about 4.5 years after the Supreme Court ruling. We're talking about almost 8 years after the ruling. What were they arguing about? Well, first of all, how much pay did they owe him? How much back pay did they have to give the guy? There was a rumor going around Ridgefield that somebody who should have been covered under his insurance while he wasn't covered had a medical issue. He had to pay for it out of pocket. Do they give it? And you know why it finally came to a head? Because the guy that they hired to replace him is retiring. And guess who's on the candidate list for the job? He wants the job again. So they had to settle the issue. Now, this is an extreme example of what could happen if you don't notice a meeting. I don't want you to think that, oh my God, we're going to, but I want that little bell to go off, that little Ridgefield bell to go off anytime you think, we don't need to worry about noticing a meeting, because the law wants you to make sure that people know what's going on. You might have an emergency situation. It could happen. This past winter, several selectmen or mayors called. They had emergency situations. Anybody want to take a shot at why? The salt. Exactly. The weather was so wretched. They'd look at Channel 30 and say, uh-oh, here comes a big one. And they looked in the salt bin and there wasn't enough. And they had to move really quickly. Really, it's Public Works guy here? Does that happen to you? Yeah. You had to move really quickly to transfer funds and buy more salt because people's safety wasn't at risk. And that's where the bar is. That's when you want to think about having a meeting like that. If you do, you have the meeting, you talk about only that topic, only that emergency topic, and within 72 hours you create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. There is a temptation when you're in that situation to, well, as long as we're all here, let's talk about other stuff. Don't do it. Make sure you only talk about that topic that's at hand. Remember that your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can come. You don't want to say, hey, you don't live in Simsbury. What are you doing here? Anybody can attend those meetings. Anybody can audio or videotape a meeting. Has that ever been a problem or an issue here? People walk in with cameras. Remember that it's allowed, but you're not in a position where you have to let them dominate the meeting. So you're set up, let's suppose the meeting room was set up here, and you say, that's the camera location over there. That's where the cameras are going to be, or the microphone's only over here. You don't want to set up parameters that are unreasonable. We once fined an individual of $500, the first selectman, because he didn't like the guy who had the camera. And he basically said, okay, put the camera out in the hall, and sort of sneak around the corner, and that clearly was not, he was claiming safety reasons or something like that didn't fly. He challenged that in court too, and by the way, the court also upheld the FOI Commission. Remember that the FOI Act does not guarantee anybody the right to speak at a public meeting. Many people think that it does. It does not. Only the right to attend, only the right to observe. So public speaking is in the hands of the board. And the board can control, let's suppose you've got a big crowd and you want to limit it to 2 or 3 minutes because you've got a lot of work to do. You can certainly do that. That's well within your right to do that. Now we're talking about making sure the meetings are open and accessible. there are a couple ways that boards can operate outside of the public arena. Has everybody heard the term going into executive session? Okay. Remember that an executive session is the portion of a public meeting that is closed to the public, or the public is excluded. If the only item you have is an executive session item, it still means you need to notice the meeting. The meeting's still noticed, and the agenda says executive session likely, executive session plan to discuss one of the 5 reasons for an executive session. You go in, you vote to go in. Again, 2/3 of those board members who are present. And then remember, you must come out of executive session to take whatever action you're going to take. You must vote in public. So you want to make sure that every action you take is recorded. It must be very clear who votes for what or for whom. The 5 reasons for executive session, stated somewhat broadly: a personnel matter, pending claims or pending litigation, a security matter, sale or lease or purchase of property. The town's going to buy a property to build a school or something like that, a police station. Talking about it publicly would negatively impact your position. You could have that discussion behind closed doors. 5th one's something of a catch-all. Allows a board or commission to go into executive session to talk about a document or documents that you believe are exempt from disclosure. They ask the attorney for a written legal opinion on a matter. They believe that opinion is covered by the attorney-client privilege. They're not going to share it with anybody. Go into executive session to talk about the advice that the attorney has given them to do. Anybody in the room deal with bids or RFPs? You have a situation where you collect bid packages or RFPs. There's an exemption to disclosure in the FOI Act for bids and RFPs and all related documents until you've actually signed the contract or concluded negotiations. So let's suppose you've got a public works board that's putting out bids for new trucks. You go into executive session to look at those bids, to look at the different bid alternates, to see where they are, so that the board can have a discussion about, where they want to go, which bidders they want to bring in for further discussion. You can have those discussions behind closed doors because the records themselves are exempt. Just a couple of examples on the records executive session. Yes, Tom?
If you have a meeting where you discuss RFP responses, would that constitute a waiver of that?
Yes, if you do it publicly, it's been waived, and you're probably not in a position to go back into executive session. Yes?
If you're dealing with children, 16 or under,
Yep.
executive session?
Not necessarily. No, I mean, it doesn't, it depends on what the topic is.
Juvenile review.
Juvenile review. I don't know that there's a specific executive session for that. I don't, unless the records, perhaps the records of the juveniles might be exempt, so that would maybe fall under that. There's nothing specific to that, though. But the records, I think Bob makes a good point. The records, these are juveniles who have been in trouble, arrested.
They made a bad decision.
Made a bad decision. Then I would say that the records are probably exempt under some of the law enforcement exemptions. So you're talking about, the board I was on was a board of education, and many of the discussions we had about students brought us into executive session.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a federal law for educational records. Yours are a little different, but that's probably how you would carry into executive session. The executive session for personnel. You want to be careful with that on a couple of levels. First of all, just saying executive session personnel is not enough. There are multiple court decisions that say you have to give us a little more. You have to say executive session personnel, discussion of the performance of a town hall employee, a police department employee, something like that. Then you have to remember that you need to notify the individual. If you're going into executive session to talk about somebody, that person has the right to know you're going to do it. And if the person comes forward and says, I don't want you, and by the way, those of you who are employees, this may apply to you sometime. If you say, I don't want you to talk about me behind closed doors, then the meeting has to be public. It cannot be behind closed doors. Now, what sometimes happens is the person comes forward and says, I want that done publicly, and the board knows that you really don't want it done publicly. It knows what the discussion is going to be about, and it says, well, we'll invite you in, and you can tell us your side of the story, or give us some evidence or some testimony. That's okay, because the board allows, the law allows the board to invite in whomever it wants to give evidence, to give testimony. But understand that in a personnel situation, and many people get this confused, there is no right to enter the executive session. The only right the individual has is the right to ask that it be done publicly. Once that's waived, whether or not the individual goes into the executive session is entirely in the hands of the board. They often invite them in, but it's not required. Then once you've taken that evidence or testimony, remember this, the person shouldn't stay in the room. You've excluded the rest of the public. You don't want to let anybody else in the room. You would, in essence, be creating a second audience, and you don't want to do that. So they should leave while the board deliberates. The executive session for pending claims and pending litigation is pretty much what it sounds like. You've been sued. There's a claim against you of some kind. You're talking about your strategy as it pertains to that. It's a little broader in that it allows a board or commission to go into executive session to talk about taking legal action. You're going to take action against somebody to protect the town's interests. So that would be covered under that as well. And the security executive session is one that, this is sort of a sad FOI story. It never came up. Never came up. But in the last year and a half it has in the wake of Sandy Hook. Boards are calling up and asking, can we go into executive session to talk about the placement of security personnel, the placement of security devices, things like that? And the answer is yes. That's the way that executive session is written. So that's happened more than any of us would want. Once is too much, but that's happened a lot in the last year and a half. Again, reminder, when you're in executive session, do not vote. Do not take action. Make sure you have discuss it till the cows come home, but when you're done, come out to take whatever action you're going to take. Are there any questions about executive session? Anything that people want to ask about? That sometimes, no. Okay, now.
I did have a question.
Yes.
With, you're saying that if you're meeting on a personnel matter, that person must be notified. What's the lead time?
The lead time, interestingly enough, there is none. I always say 24 hours is pretty safe because that's when the agenda has to be in. There's nothing that says specifically, and so I would say 24 hours is a safe bet. As I said, two paths that boards and commissions can take to exclude the public. The second one is a little more difficult to explain because it leaves you scratching your head. I read you the definition of a meeting. The sentence that follows that says, meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. There follows a list of gatherings, many of which everybody in this room would call a meeting. But for the purposes of freedom of information, the legislature has told us that these are not to be considered meetings. You can call them whatever you want, but they're not meetings, which means they're not noticed, they're not open, and there are no minutes when you're done. The problem is that you think of them as meetings, and you instinctively call them meetings, but they're not for the purposes of FOI. The term that people have taken to using around the state is the non-meeting. Has anybody heard that term, the non-meeting? You talk about wanting to bang your head against the wall when you try to explain something to somebody. At the top of the list is collective bargaining. Anybody here do collective bargaining, right? If you've ever done it, it's the most fun you've ever had in your life, right? You sit at a table, right? They give you a proposal, you giggle. You counter proposal, they giggle back. You go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth all night long. You leave after 4 hours. You go home and you say, oh, I just had a 4-hour non-meeting. Try that on your spouse sometime. Try that. But it's not noticed, it's not open, there are no minutes, and the idea, I think, is if you're collective bargaining, it's nothing that anybody else has to be involved in. Also in that category, the executive level search committee. A police chief retires, a superintendent of schools retires, you form an executive level search committee, and that operates outside of freedom of information. Now that one makes some sense if you think about it, because if you're looking for the best candidates for the job, you're probably going to get people who are already employed somewhere else, and they don't want their current employers to know it. So, I mean, that one makes a lot of sense. But that falls into that category of things that are not a meeting. And again, if you've ever been on one of those search committees, you could sit there for hours going over candidates and resumes and interviewing. It feels like a meeting. It feels like you should be calling it a meeting, but for FOI purposes, it's not. Social gatherings, chance gatherings. When you get new members of boards, one of the first things, if they're at all savvy about FOI, they say is, oh, now we can't go out to dinner anymore. Well, you can go out to dinner, but there's a line in there, and I chuckle when I read this. Neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. What else are they going to talk about, right? Let's be real. And let's also be real. Where does some of the best meetings in Connecticut take place? In the parking lot when the meeting's over, right? Look, the conversations take place. Let's not be naive, but let's realize that that's not where the major deliberations should take place. Sure, people are going to exchange ideas, We are not the FOI FBI. I'm not coming out here with handcuffs after the next council meeting because people are talking in the parking lot. But you have to be aware that if the wrong discussion takes place and the wrong person hears it, and we act upon a complaint, the idea is not to do your business in private, not to do your business offline, it's to do it publicly. So you want to be really careful when you have those social gatherings that the big budget decision's not made over the eggnog at the Christmas party. You just want to avoid that. You want to understand what the law tells you to do. Also in that category is the caucus. Now, the caucus is a major thorn in the side of people who like open government because it says that members of the same board and the same party can caucus. This, I believe, was one of the major sticking points in getting to that unanimous vote that I told you about. There were rumblings that, well, gee, why isn't that a meeting? Well, people were sort of put off and said, look, that's just about who's going to bring donuts to headquarters on Saturday morning, who's going to put the street signs up on Main Street. It has morphed into more than that. If you think about it, think about a 7-member board and 4 of them are the same party and they sit down and they go over everything. Well, they walk into the meeting, they've pretty much got it locked if they're in agreement. That doesn't sort of mesh with the idea of open government. People get into trouble with the caucus though because they forget that it's only same board, same party. Let's have the town chair come in. Let's have the town manager come in. Things. And once that happens, it's not a caucus anymore. It's a meeting. So you want to be really careful if you're going to caucus or your people are going to caucus that it's only same board, same party. The whole caucus thing was an argument. People say, well, shouldn't we be able to do that with the town chair? And then you get situations. This past week, the mayor in one of the cities, they call up all excited. He's ex officio. Well, ex officio means you're a member, so it could be the caucus. Just tell your people to be careful that if they're going to caucus, that it's only people who are considered members of the board. It's a good time to throw out back to the definition of meeting. It said whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. Electronic equipment was written 39 years ago for the powerful mayor who would get on the phone and say, okay, I need your vote on this, your vote on this, you need to do this, boom, 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 boom. You walk into a meeting, it's packed house, all in favor, all opposed, and everybody's looking around, where's the debate, where's the discussion? It took place on the phone before the meeting took place, and you can't do that. And in 2014, we're talking about a lot more than telephones, aren't we? We're talking about email exchanges. We're talking about text. We're talking about Twitter. We're talking about things that I can't even comprehend. I'm a technological dinosaur. I don't know half of this stuff. I'm not telling you and your board people to stop using these things to disseminate information. The chairman gets a letter from a constituent. He wants to share it with everybody. Email it out. This is what I think we should do with this issue. Let's talk about it at the next meeting. Send it out. Agenda discussions. When's the meeting going to be? All of that's fine. But you avoid the deliberative conversations via those vehicles that you should be having at the table. It gets really dicey sometimes because you send it out to everybody and all you need is one board member to not understand that and say, I think that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard, and initiates a discussion that should not be held via email. And the problem, of course, is not only is it an improper meeting, you've created a public record that if somebody wants to see it, they'll see it, and it's clear that you're doing business behind closed doors, in essence, behind closed doors. So you want to make sure that the boards and commissions understand the extent to which they should use these vehicles. The other thing we should talk about when we talk about meetings is minutes. Does anybody here have that responsibility? Minutes? A few poor unfortunate souls. Remember that minutes need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They need not be every word that everybody says. Although someone may say, I'm saying this now and I want every word in the minutes. That's really up to the boards, folks. That's really up to what you and your boards and what you should put in is kind of up to you. The only legal requirement is a record of the votes. Who votes for what or for whom. Beyond that, you have to create the historical record. Obviously, you're putting more than just the votes in your minutes. You're creating the historical records, but you want a crisp, clear, concise summary of what happens, not every word that everybody says. One of the reasons that that's important is that the minutes need to be available in 7 days. Those minutes are there within 7 days. A lot of people say, wait a minute, we don't meet again. We can't approve those minutes in 7 days. Doesn't matter. They're there, they're available in 7 days. they're approved perhaps at the next set. If people want to see the final, the next set says minutes of the previous meeting approved with the following changes. If they want to see the changes, they'd have to balance the two, but those minutes need to be there in 7 days. Anything about minutes or meetings that we haven't touched on before we talk about records? Did you have anything you wanted to throw in?
Just on the text messages, emails, if a member of the agency says in response, yeah, I've got that, I'm glad we're having a meeting because that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, that expression has not violated
No,
the FOI.
no.
It's the
It's
response.
a conversation.
It's the conversation, the exchange of ideas that crosses the line for FOI. So don't think that if someone on your board says, yeah, I'll be there, I can't wait, this is the stupidest thing ever to
Right.
come before us, don't think that that violates FOI. It's not a good thing to do. It's when other members respond and say, what do you mean? I think this is a great idea. Now we got to.
That's when you vote.
Yeah.
And that's what I said, the line is sort of fuzzy, but Bob makes a good point. I use the dumbest thing I've ever heard. That's fine until the response starts back and forth. You just want to be so careful.
Tom, you may have said this already, and I apologize if I missed it. Motions have to be posted sooner than 7 days, right?
There needs to be a record of votes available in 48 hours. There's technically not a requirement that a formal document be created. So I've got to be able to come to town hall and say, how did they vote 2 days ago? And that's got to be there. So most places put together some sort of a sheet, but there's no real requirement for a formal document.
Thank you.
Yes?
Two questions getting to what Tom just said. So if you had a meeting on a Thursday night and you close at, say, 12 on Friday,
Uh-huh.
your votes have to be available by then? It's less than 48 hours, or do you have till
No, I think it
Monday?
would be 48 business hours. I think you'd have till Monday morning to
Okay.
do that.
And my second question is posting agendas for special meetings on the website. What if your internet is down? Do you have to cancel the meeting?
Excellent question. No. The law says on the website, if available. If available. So if your website is down or for some reason you can't get it on there, it's okay. Yes?
We meet on a Monday night, and circumstances deter you from being able to get in your minutes until the following Monday. Is that?
Well, I mean, if somebody comes in and asks for them and files a complaint, yes, it's a problem down the road, but that happens a lot. Let's think about 169 towns and communities and all the various boards. I suspect not everybody's in within 7 days. The issue would be if somebody filed a complaint, that would be a technical violation. I mean, if you're in 24 hours late, I don't think the world is going to end. The technical answer is it's a violation, but it's not. I don't think it's major. Now, if someone comes in and it's 6 months and the minutes aren't there, that could be a different story. Yeah. You do the best you can. The law isn't written for volunteers, but the reality is that there are a lot of volunteers doing this kind of work. So.
Well, I guess my thought was that sometimes circumstances are such that I may not get it actually to my chairman or to the town until the following Monday.
Right. And, I think that's probably, in most instances, 99.9% of the time, that would be no issue at all.
So I just heard 48 hours to record votes
Right.
and 7 days to record the initial version of the minutes, the
Right.
draft minutes.
Right.
Earlier, I thought you said 72 hours.
That's for an emergency meeting.
Okay, for an emergency
meeting
meeting.
only. That's correct. That's correct.
And is there a different timing for the vote on that, or is it just 72
No,
hours?
72 hours for the whole package.
Okay.
Right.
Can you talk about what's an acceptable request or the form of request from somebody? In other words, is verbal acceptable?
For
Email?
records, we're about to
For
do
records,
records.
for
We're about to do records. That's coming. Yes, sir.
Just one more question on the noticing and hours. If we, let's take this Tuesday as an example, we have a Tuesday morning meeting at 7 a.m., the day after Memorial Day. We need to, can't wait, we need to notice that, now, the town clerk's office needs to be open in order to, so we couldn't notice that Monday morning anyway. We couldn't
Right.
notice it Saturday or Sunday.
I would say
It'd be
Friday
by
morning at 7 o'clock, that meeting.
Friday morning at 7
Yeah.
o'clock.
Right.
Or, but why couldn't it be at Friday in the afternoon, I guess? Is it 24 business hours? Is that-
It's got to, I think it's not hard and fast, but I think the basic answer is yes. So my recommendation would be Friday morning at 7 o'clock.
Don't worry, we noticed it yesterday.
That's all right. That's all right. Yes,
Tom, could you go into a little more detail on subcommittees
sure.
and the responsibilities there?
Subcommittee, a board forms a subcommittee. The subcommittee is basically a public agency and needs to follow the law the same way. It needs to make sure its meetings are noticed, that they're open to the public, and their minutes when they're done. All the things we talked about with the board applies to a subcommittee.
I'll make a distinction though, but FOI applies to public agencies.
Right.
And a lot of times you'll have a committee that is working with a board, say for the dog park committee, or not formally formed by the public agency. And the question becomes, is that committee of well-intentioned citizens not formed by a public agency subject to FOI? And I think the answer is
No.
no.
Right.
Thanks.
But these are your PTAs,
Yeah.
your little leagues, your softball associations.
We have a
Yeah,
case.
right,
A case.
right.
Softball association, they rent the fields like anyone else, and there was a complaint that the softball association, because the allegation was it was so intertwined with the Department of Culture, Parks and Recreation that it was de facto a public agency. And we argued it was not, and we were able to prevail on it.
Right. So, does that help? Staff meetings, they're not covered either.
But I'll draw another distinction, but the subcommittee doesn't acquire the status of a public agency only when the Board of Selectmen adopts a 5-page resolution. If the Board of Selectmen is responsible for these people meeting and gathering to discuss the topic that the Board of Selectmen has chosen for them to discuss, I think that.
Yes,
Even
absolutely.
without the formality of a vote, would be considered a public agency. for
Absolutely.
FOI. And they may not know that, and they may not post.
I mean, if your selectmen or your Park and Recreation Commission or your Police Commission forms a committee, then it falls under
Yeah, it could be
the,
something like, I think we ought to have some people look at this, why don't we get a group together? If that's in the minutes, if that's why they're meeting, that's gonna be
Right.
a public agency.
yes,
Got an agency, a group that's authorized to meet, they've
Got multiple topics, and they decide to break into working groups. They're gonna distribute to different places within the building during a noticed meeting. Do you have one noticed meeting plus 3, or is it all one meeting once they split up?
they notice it in the building and then they decide at the meeting to do the split.
In advance.
Yeah, they have
The
breakdown.
notice says they're gonna have working sessions in 3 different rooms.
I would suggest that you should probably at least notice the fact that you're gonna do these 3 working groups.
We'll
So
put up a
that,
sign saying,
yeah, working group A, B, and C. I think under that circumstance, you could probably get by with one agenda and one set of minutes, just as long as the minutes reflected what each working group did. If the working groups then split off and met at different times in different places, I would recommend separate notices and separate, does that sound like
Yeah.
good advice?
The other thing that comes up all the time is you notice a meeting for this room and too many people show up. And you say, well, we really, fire marshal's gonna have a fit if we stay here, we gotta find a bigger room. And you move to a bigger room. But you don't wanna renotice the meeting.
Right.
And usually the sign will be put up on the door saying, we're not here anymore, we're at the high school.
Right. There's a section that allows you to do that for particular reasons. You put a sign on the door that says this meeting has been moved to such and such a place and time. That, again, not in the law. I always recommend that if you have to do that, you leave somebody behind. So in case people are coming later, say, look, we had to move it, we didn't have enough room.
And you can choose who to leave behind, too.
Yeah, that's right, that's right, that's right. Anything else on meetings? Yes,
When posting a meeting,
yes.
where and how does it have to be posted? It's
Well,
more than just website.
the agenda needs to be available. For a regular meeting, just needs to be available in the clerk's office and your board's office if they have one, just available. The posting comes in only for a special meeting, and it needs to be on the website and posted on some sort of a public board if you have one.
In Simsbury, it's the board across from the town clerk's office. You post it there, you're solid.
Right.
So it doesn't have to go to the papers.
No.
Yeah, if you post it
No.
on the side of your file cabinet in your office, you probably got a problem.
There are requirements for different land use meetings and town meetings and things like that for newspaper publication, but not under freedom of
There
information.
is no general FOI requirement to do a legal notice in the newspaper for meetings,
Right,
thankfully.
that's right. Okay, public records. I'm going to read for you the definition in two parts. Public records or files means any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract, whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. Part 2. Except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, all records maintained or kept on file by any public agency, whether or not such records are required by any law or by any rule or regulation, shall be public records, and every person shall have the right to inspect such records promptly during regular office or business hours, copy such records in accordance with, and it gives you the section number, or receive a copy of such records in accordance with Section 1-212. Bottom line, what I just read to you is that the state of Connecticut says that every record held by every public agency, created by every public agency, is defined as a public record. Everything. And in theory, someone can walk into any office at any time and say, I want to see that record, I want to inspect that record, or give you a written request for a copy. Now, if it were that simple, we could, class dismissed, we go home. But on top of those base definitions, there are what we call in the freedom of information business the 3 E's. There are exceptions, there are exclusions, and there are exemptions to disclosure. The eyes are rolling to the backs of the heads in the audience. Why are you telling us that everything's a public record and then telling us that we have these things that are exempt? Because all too often people who do what we do start off in the wrong direction. Well, you look like a nice guy. We'll give them to you. You look very suspicious. You can't have them. And you used to be a journalist, so we're certainly not giving them to you. You can't do that. Or, you've been coming in a lot. Get out of here. We don't want to deal with you anymore. But you're new, so you can. There is a temptation to deal with records requests in a more selective, more personal manner. You want to first understand that everything's a public record. And throw your intuition out. Gee, that's not something I think they should be able to see. If it's in the public arena, it's a public record. Then you apply the exemptions. Then you look to see whether or not anything applies. You have a right to review almost every record you give out, but you want to make sure you understand that everything's defined as a public record. Now, I used to make up a little story to share with people about what not to do when people come in and ask for records. But a few years ago, bless their hearts, the city of Hartford gave me a real live example of what not to do. I will share it with you. The requester in this instance is we'll call him a quasi-journalist. He does a blog, he does a public access TV thing, he writes a lot of op-ed pieces, he's active. And he's been around a lot, so we can understand, those of us who have been on both sides of this, that they maybe have had enough of him. But everybody has the right. This law was written, the tent is pretty big. So he asks the city of Hartford for 2 things. He asks them for a record of record of bills from a particular law firm that was doing work for the city, and then a record of payment to that law firm by the city. So the Corporation Counsel's Office in Hartford responds, I have your FOI request and will coordinate the response. Such documentation as is allowed or required by law will be provided. Now, folks, when you get a written request for records, the law says you have to respond within 4 business days. This is a response. A lot of people think, oh my God, 4 days. No, 4 days, at the very least, you must respond and say, we've got your request, we're looking into it. This is not inappropriate. I would also recommend maybe putting a time frame on it so you give the person some idea how long it's going to take. But this is fine. This is fine for a 4-day response. So what's the problem? The problem is that in the process of responding to this individual whom he does not like, the Corporation Counsel in Hartford accidentally copied him on an email about how much he didn't like the guy. Back to my original point, everything is a public record. Now, this is a public record that might not have seen the light of day had he not hit the wrong button, which, by the way, is something I might have done. got to think, folks, about what you write and where you send it, and because everything is a public record. Mixed company, we're also being recorded, so I'll clean it up, but you'll get the idea. Carl, so who lit a fire under this? It's a very bad word. Starts with an A. If he's involved in litigation, ongoing and/or other projects that he hasn't asked about, can I shut him down? This is now in the hands of the requester. Not, thank you for your request, I'm looking into it. It's your, and he's a journalist. Bang, it's on his blog. Bang, it's on public access TV, and he's connected. It's in the Current the next morning. It's on WFSB at 6 o'clock with the little bleeping and the things like that. This is not good. You don't want to go down this road. So the guy tries to back up. He says, gee, maybe that was a little, dumb thing to do. But he can't do it. He doesn't like them. This is written the same day, almost supposed to be a letter of apology, but he can't do it. Apparently you have little else to do other than to pester me in this office and other city departments. Recall that I do not work for you. The purpose of the FOIA statute is not to provide you a playground. Even if you think it, don't write it. Again, everything is a public record. You have to understand that people have these basic rights. You have to say, okay, I don't like you, but do you have a right to these records? P.S. He doesn't like him. He doesn't give them any of the other records. The guy files a complaint, and none of them are exempt. He never even bothered to check whether any of them were exempt. Hartford loses at FOI commission again. There's no point to going down that road, folks. Even if the most difficult person walks in and wants to see a record, if it's a record that's just sitting there, you let them look at it. And if you have to review it or if you have to look through piles of records, one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give you is this. Let me stop for a second. How many have been subject to fishing expeditions? People who come in and just ask for just tons of stuff they don't know what. The first order of business is to say, look, you're asking me for a lot of stuff. You don't have to tell me, but if you tell me what you're trying to find out, maybe we can work together on this. We can narrow the scope of this request. It will take me less time to get you the actual information that you want. It will cost you less money because you can charge for copies. We'll talk about that in a second. And everybody's happier. Now, I wish I could tell you that this worked all the time. But again, anecdotally, it works more often than you might think. So your first reaction might be, oh dear, what am I, but try to work. Then, if they balk, if they say no, then you've given it your best shot there. Then you have to understand what you would have. You have some rights as well as obligations. Number one, you have a right to charge. You can charge up to 50 cents a page. The cost of copying can add up pretty quickly. And if the cost of copying is going to exceed $10, you can collect your money up front.
But you can't charge if all they want to do is inspect.
Inspect, right. Remember that to inspect a record, no charge. But if they've put in a written request for copies, you can charge them 50 cents a page.
The other part about this.
Yeah, sure. No, that's okay.
This is what's called, the fishing expedition in FOI language is called an overly vague request. And there are cases that determine what's an overly vague request. It's different than an overly broad request. An overly broad request, to me, says they want to look at a lot of things, but they've been fairly definitive about what those things are. You can't object to a request because it's overly broad if it's properly defined.
That's correct.
You can object if it's overly vague in that you can't figure out what they want. If they say, give me every document produced by the town in the year 1957, that to me would be overly vague. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what FOI looks for when considering a response that a request is overly vague.
If people ask for records and it's not clear what they're asking for, you have every right to go back at them and say what exactly you're looking for. One of the problems is, and I'm going to be candid here, is that in this electronic age, the requests have started going a little crazy. Boom, 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 send. And they just, any and all, and any and all, and any and all, and emails, and this and that. We're trying to work up some language, get ready, that will give the agencies a little bit of control. But in the interim, if they've asked for a lot of things and are not willing to narrow or not willing to back down, change, then then your tool is this. I told you about the 4-day response. Remember that if somebody asks for records, either to inspect them or for copies, the law does not say that you have to give them the records within 4 days. In fact, the law says you must provide access to these records promptly. Promptly. Does anybody have a clue as to what that might mean? Well, that went to court when the law was first written, and the court says, we got this one. Promptly means without undue delay. Now, that means you don't have a number of hours, days, weeks, months. It's not specified, but it does give you the interpretive power, there's that word again, to say, okay, how long is it going to reasonably take us to find these records, wherever they might be, to review them, to make sure there is nothing that is exempt in them, to make sure that there are records that should or should not be released. You frame the promptness. So, in the situation where someone's asked for a lot, the overly broad, it may indeed be overly broad, but there's no overly broad exemption in the FOI Act. You say, okay, you want all these, we can't get you to narrow, but you need to understand that the law does not require me to bring my office to a screeching, grinding halt because you've made an FOI request. There's a balance. It's an important concept. Open government is important, but not at the expense of everything else you have to do. So you fit it in. And if someone says, well, I want to inspect all these records first, which means you can't charge them, Bob reiterated that point, then you say, okay, you can inspect them, but don't think you're going to come and sit in here for a week because we have work to do. So you've got 2 hours tomorrow, you've got an hour Thursday, you've got an hour next Wednesday. You can frame it that way if you're reasonable, prompt. So that's how you would deal with some of those larger requests. The idea about prompt access is there are some people, and I guess I'm repeating this to make a point, who think that for them, prompt is immediate. We have one gentleman who makes requests that way and says, I demand prompt access now. Well, it really depends on what's going on. If it's an agenda that's just sitting on a desk, prompt is fewer than those 4 days. Don't think that you have 4 days every time somebody makes a request. It's immediate. If you wait 4 days to send somebody an agenda that's already prepared and sitting there, that's not prompt. But you have to decide, you have to figure out what's reasonable and what makes sense when it comes to that. The thing with records requests also is when they say they want to inspect a record, remember that means they can look at it, there's no charge, you're not making them a copy, but you're still the curator of the records, I guess is the best way to put it. So it doesn't mean you hand it to them and let them walk out the door. If you need to sit with them while they look at records, if you need to make sure that your records are not damaged. There was a run a couple years ago, people were walking in the town clerk's offices and ripping pages out of land books. So they came up with some security measures to make sure you have a right to keep the records safe. And remember that you need not create a record that doesn't exist. I suspect that many of you have had that happen. People come in and say, I want to report on X, Y, and Z, and you don't have one. You're under no obligation to create it.
And you don't have the obligation to create an opinion about a record. A lot of times you get an FOI request, say, I want these 5 things, and I want your opinion, or what do you think of this, or isn't this? FOI doesn't require you to state your opinion one way or the other regarding a record.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, in order to guard your records, is it appropriate to visually record the inspection process while it's being done?
Well, sure, that's what I said. If you want to sit with the person while they inspect those records,
Equipment.
if you want to do that, that's fine too. Many town clerk's office in reaction to what I was talking about, they've done that as well.
Thank
Yes. Yeah, nothing stops you from doing that. Yes.
What about when someone takes out their cell phone and uses their camera to
Okay.
take pictures?
Excellent question. The law has a provision for the use of a handheld scanner. It's at the end of section 1-212 if you want to read it. It defines specifically what the handheld scanner is. It talks about basically a wanding device. Unfortunately, once the law was finally put into place, the technology described there kind of became obsolete. People don't use it. Now, we have a court case in a situation where a person wanted to use a portable flatbed scanner. And we said no because the law doesn't say that, and the courts upheld that. and said, that's absolutely right, only the handheld scanner. I still haven't answered your question, have I? Because when you come in with a phone, some of those phones actually have scanning apps on them. Now that, again, that's way over my head. I hadn't heard of that until a couple months ago. Somebody told me that. But here's the thing. If they're going to use their phone, it doesn't say phone, it says handheld scanner. Here's what I put on the table. Again, not in the law. You can disagree with this. My advice is this. You're allowed to charge $20 for a handheld scanner use. I would suggest, as you could technically, I think, say no to the phone, but I would say, how about this? We'll take your $20 and you can use your phone instead of the handhelds, because basically that's kind of what you're doing. And then you avoid being the test case. You avoid being the person who says no to the person with the phone and having the phone complainant come to us and having that sort of mushroom into a complaint and a court case and stuff like that. It will happen someday, but when people ask me, that's the only honest advice. I don't. Do you agree with that?
Well, we just had this. An individual was using a phone to take photographs of land record documents, and we had to address that. It really does need a legislative.
It needs a legislative fix.
Because some of these phones now, they're 40 gigabytes or whatever of resolution. They're better than any
Right.
handheld scanner that was available in the market when we've always used.
Right.
That really does need to be clarified, because it's hard to give a definitive answer, yes or no,
Right.
on a phone. Because, you know, it doesn't touch the document.
Right.
And people are taking pictures of documents all the time other places.
Let me see. I'll find it real.
I think the best advice is if land records are a separate category of records, because there's a strong need to preserve the integrity of the land record system. But if it's not a land record and they're in your office and they want to take a photograph of a document like the grand list or something with their handheld phone, I think the best advice is, go ahead.
Well, you can do that as well. But here's the provision. Any individual may copy a public record through the use of a handheld scanner. A public agency may establish a fee structure not to exceed $20 for an individual to pay each time the individual copies records at the agency with a handheld scanner. As used in this section, handheld scanner means a battery-operated electronic scanning device, the use of which leaves no mark or impression on the public record and does not unreasonably interfere with the operation of the public agency. That's what the law says. So, that's why I say, maybe you want to get your $20 and move on. But that's not, you're kind of making a call. So, let's talk a little bit about those 3 E's. I'm not going to go on and on about them, but just so you have some idea how they work. Exceptions, exclusions, and exemptions. Piece of the law says, except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute. That means that if there's a federal law or a state statute on the books that says thou shalt not release, it would override anything that's in the FOI Act, and you wouldn't give out the records. The problem with those is that they are not in the FOI Act. They are scattered everywhere. We mentioned the federal law that covers educational records. Well, the education people know those sort of things. But in our state statutes, there are little do not discloses everywhere. And sometimes you just can't know where they are. So my recommendation is to look at any statutes that might govern or cover the records that you keep or are in charge of. And you might be surprised to find that there are certain records embedded in there that you do not release that would override FOI. I told you that I was a journalist before I joined FOI, and I've been doing this, I'm in my 14th year. And in order to have them comfortable, have me come out and tell people things and answer questions on the phone, I had to be trained. So they trained me and they teach me the law, and I studied it, and I'm ready to go. And, okay, you're ready, go answer the phones. The first week, true story, first week answering the phones, a woman calls me up and says, I would like to see my child's teacher's evaluation. Child's teacher's evaluation. I'm a parent. I said, gee, that's not a bad idea. So I'm looking through the FOI Act. I can't find a single word, not a single word that addresses teacher evaluations, not one word. So I said to her, I think you can have that. I think you should get that. Now, fortunately, somebody heard me give that answer. What's the matter? You better call her back. So why? Well, now embedded into my brain is the fact that section 10-151C says that public school teacher evaluations in Connecticut cannot be released. Did anybody know that? So you learned one thing today, right? I told you I was a journalist. One of the things that I used to cover was education. Next week, I will be married for 31 years to a teacher. I didn't know that we couldn't see her evaluation. There are little gems like that throughout statute. So you could call me up and ask me. I might know it. I might know about 10-151C. There are, for instance, elsewhere in statute about gun permit applications. You can't get them, but it's not in the FOI Act. So I happen to know that one because there's been a lot of conversation about that lately, and we looked it up. So just have some idea what those exceptions are.
Bells should go off, though, for certain categories of records. One is education records, generally. Second is health records, generally. The third would be any kind of record that discloses personal information like social security numbers that aren't part of the public's business. So whenever a request involves that, that's why it's important to inspect records before they're disclosed, because you don't want to inadvertently give out a education record because there's information within a record that otherwise isn't exempt that would violate the exclusion.
You would then redact that record.
And the fourth category would be any police record. Any request for police records, generally, anybody who gets it from any source should be carefully reviewed, because there are a number of exceptions for police records, unsubstantiated allegations of criminal conduct, for instance, is a big one. Although we want to promptly comply, it's my view that the exceptions and the exemptions are as important part of the law as the general rule for disclosure. So we don't want to keep anybody from what they're entitled to look at. On the other hand, every one of these exemptions and exemptions is intended to protect the rights of somebody else. And health records, everybody can understand that. Then it gets into what is exactly a health record.
Which we're going to talk about.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's why when people get upset that we can't give them a record this afternoon, you should politely explain to them that there are a lot that has to be gone through before the record can be released.
The promptness provisions are, all of what Bob just said is applicable. I mean, the idea of finding it and reviewing it is all part of what comes into your answer as to how long it's going to take. You have a right to review records, and some of the categories he just mentioned could clearly fall into some of these exempt areas, so you would want to look at them before you even before you said you can have part of this or none of this. That's why you have a right to review them. The second of the three E's that we talk about, before we get into some of what Bob just brought up, the exclusions. Section 1-217 of the FOI Act talks about not releasing the home address of certain individuals. Now, again, we could be here for a couple hours on this one too. This one's gone back and forth. The bottom line is that the legislature did a really good job fixing this, because it was kind of out there that no agency could give out the home address of judges, police officers, correction officers. There's a whole list of them. There's 12 categories. DOC was sending workers into town hall saying, I am a DOC worker, this certifies it, take my address off of everything you have. I want you to think about trying to take addresses off of land records and off of tax records and off of grand lists and things like that.
Land use permit application.
You can't, well, there was this big uproar and this huge coalition that involved the clerks and CCM and land use attorneys and a lot of registrars, a lot of people. And a couple years ago, the legislature fixed this. It no longer applies to grand lists, if anybody ever thought that it did, or tax records or land records. You don't change those. You don't take those addresses off. It also requires an individual to come forward and say, I am a sworn member of a police department. I mean, you probably have police officers in Simsbury who aren't Simsbury police officers. And how would you know? I mean, when they sign up to vote, they don't tell you they're a police officer. So it's now incumbent upon them to say any record that might be applicable. And it also says that the town has to, a reasonable search, I think is the word. So if you don't know and you don't find it easily, you're not in any trouble. There was a real concern about liability. But let's suppose that your Park and Recreation Commission has a judge on it, and someone asked for a roster of Park and Rec members, the idea there would be to redact that judge's home address before you gave that list out.
What about when Judge Smith comes in and he's giving you proper notice, I don't want my address in any public record, but he wants to put a shed in his backyard, and it requires a variance, so he's got to file a variance application. That application has to disclose the address.
That's correct.
And I get the question sometimes, well, do we have to redact out the address from that variance
And the
application?
answer is no. I don't think you do.
I don't think.
Yes.
A couple of years ago, I had a gentleman come in and wanted to review the personnel file of a former police officer who was actually running against him for office in a different state, and wanted to sit down and review the entire personnel file. Well, because of the address rule, I wanted to be careful to redact the address of this police officer throughout his entire personnel file. It was multiple inches thick. And by doing so, I had to I couldn't black out the address of the actual file, so I had to make copies, and actually ultimately copies of the copies, so that he could see blacked out versions. Now, it may seem like a technicality, but I made hundreds of copies. Are we allowed to charge for that?
There is a case, which I don't have in front of me, that says that if you are required by law to make a redaction, you can charge for the copies. Now, that would be under 217, and I would argue that is an address that you would have to hold back. So I would think in that case the answer would be yes. If you want, later this afternoon or next week, send me an email, and I will send you a copy of that case so that you can have it. Okay. The third of the 3 E's. Again, this could be an hour-long discussion, but I'm going to wrap it up pretty soon. The exemptions. They are in the Freedom of Information Act. They're in Section 1-210, and they cover some of what Bob was referring to. The difficulty with these, from a public servant standpoint, is that these exemptions are what are called permissive. These are records you are allowed to withhold, but not obligated to withhold. So you look at them and say, do these records fall under these categories? Yes. Now, am I going to hold them back because I think the public's best interest is not served in releasing them, or am I going to give them out anyway? It puts 2 burdens on you. First of all, figuring out whether it falls in one of those categories, and then whether or not the record's going to be released. The first 2 are shall not release. This one is may not release. In that category is personnel records, records that might have trade secrets in them, records created as part of strategy negotiations with respect to collective bargaining or lawsuits. The attorney-client privilege exemption is in there, which means it's permissive, which means even if it is covered by it and you want to give it out, not many do, you're allowed to. We talked about the bids and RFPs earlier. That's a permissive exemption. I told you you can withhold them. You're not obligated to. Anybody here from Park and Rec? There's an exemption in there that allows you to withhold the names and addresses of minors enrolled in Park and Rec departments. You're allowed to do that. You don't have to, but you're allowed to. It's important that you look at those exemptions and know what they are. Again, if people are coming in and asking for records, do any of these exemptions apply, so that when you review the records that are being requested, you know whether or not it falls under one of the exemptions. Let me talk to you a little bit about personnel records. It affects everybody, probably everybody in this room. When you come from the private sector to the public sector, you think it's in a personnel file, nobody's going to get it. But when you work for a public agency, that becomes a public record. To not disclose something in a personnel file, the agency has to determine that releasing it would be an invasion of the person's privacy. To determine that something's an invasion of somebody's privacy, you go to a 1993 state Supreme Court case. It's called the Perkins decision, which set the standards. It said that was a case where a teacher objected to the release of her attendance records. And the Supreme Court said the attendance records of all of us who work in the public sector are public records, period, end of story, and should be released. And then it said to have been an invasion of this woman's privacy, the release of those records would have to have been both highly offensive and not a matter of public concern. It has to meet both prongs of the test. So somebody comes into town hall and wants to see something in a personnel file, you look at it and say, would releasing this be an invasion of this person's privacy? Would it be highly offensive to release it? And would it not be a matter of public concern? Meets both prongs of the test. If you believe that that is the case, you then have to go to the individual and say, would releasing this be an invasion of privacy? We think it would be. What do you think? If the individual says, I don't care, then out the record goes. If the individual says, yes, it's an invasion of my privacy, don't give it out, then you cannot give out the record. It cannot be released until or unless the person making the request files a complaint with the FOI Commission, and the FOI Commission says, sorry, Simsbury, you were wrong, no invasion of privacy, give the record out. Example, Middletown. Situation where a police officer was rumored to be doing things at home that weren't so terrific. Not so nice. Rumors get around, they put him on desk duty, they said, we got to look into this. So they do a complete and thorough investigation. They conduct an internal affairs investigation, they do an IA report, and they find that the guy's having a lot of trouble at home. And the report has a lot of information about what the troubles are. But then it says, it has nothing to do with how he's doing his job. He's doing a terrific job. In fact, we're going to put him back on the street. Hartford Current hears about it, wants to see the report. Middletown PD says there's a lot of information about this guy's home life in there. That's nobody's business. Invasion of privacy, we're not giving it out. The Current files a complaint with the FOI Commission. Again, it's its right, files a complaint. But when the FOI Commission looks at the document in camera, which is why, by the way, what we do, the hearing officer will look at a document that's in dispute behind closed doors. Too much about the guy's home life in there, and there's a complete disconnect. It would be highly offensive to tell the world what was going on in this guy's home. It was nobody's business. People were curious. It was nobody's business. And it clearly was not a matter of public concern because it didn't affect his job. Highly offensive and not it met both prongs of the test. A lot of people automatically say, personnel records request, we're going to go talk to the employee. I would recommend against that. You should at least look to make sure it rises to the level of invasion of privacy, because if you don't and the complaint is filed, then you're stuck going to Hartford to answer a complaint about a record that you don't even know if it rises to that level. The complaint comes against the town, not the individual whose record it is. So it's an important distinction to understand. Yes?
How does that work with a former employee? Is there still an argument that the public has an interest?
Again, it depends on circumstances. It could. I mean, clearly it could. Let's suppose it's an embezzlement thing. The guy's, long gone, but there's money still floating around. The public could have an interest in that. It's so case by case and so fact specific, but it could, sure. And that, by the way, a former employee is still a personnel file. It's still, so absolutely.
Let's talk about liability. A town employee gets this request, makes a determination that doesn't meet the Perkins test, releases the record. The town gets sued by the employee for releasing the record.
Okay.
What's the town's liability for that? And maybe a trade secret would be another one. The town it's a permissive exemption. The town makes the determination that, well, yeah, we're going to release it anyway. It's too much trouble to go to FOI. And the company says, hey, wait a minute, that's valuable information you just released, and sues the town. Are there cases that define the liability of the town?
I know of none. It's a legitimate question, but I know of none off the top of my head. The thing with the trade secrets is a lot of people will walk in with a pile of papers that are part of a formal application for something, and the information they have is required information. The trade secrets, they have to understand that they're giving it to a public agency.
Right.
And ultimately you could be ordered to release it. So the liability issue is a whole different kettle of fish, and it's not easily addressed.
The one issue that everybody should understand that are public employees, though, if you make a good faith decision in the scope of your job to release a record, you are indemnified under separate statutes, and the town has a duty to defend any lawsuit that's brought against you individually. So having been personally subject to such lawsuits, I can tell you, knowing that helps you sleep better at night, and inform your spouse of that.
That's right.
Especially if your name's on the deed.
Bob mentioned law enforcement records. Many of the police records issues are in section 1-210 as well. He mentioned uncorroborated allegations. There's one of the larger ones is if a case is under investigation, if there's a criminal activity that's still being investigated, the police are allowed to withhold the records until they've concluded their investigation. Those are some of the ones that are in there as well. Were there any records in particular that anybody wanted to ask about? Any specific records? Let me share one more exemption with you then, just to show you that somebody somewhere has a sense of humor. In the Freedom of Information Act, freedom of information in the state of Connecticut, there is an exemption for any information obtained by the use of illegal means. So if you steal it, you don't have to give it out. Anybody have a clue, background, where that comes from? In the mid-'70s in New Haven, there was a Black Panther murder trial. Bobby Seale was on trial for murder. And the New Haven PD evidently did a couple of wiretaps that it maybe shouldn't have done. And their legislator quick ran up to Hartford and got them an exemption so they didn't have to give them out. I told you I do these all over the state, and I did one a couple months ago at the Police Training Academy in Meriden. You know, memo to Tom, guys with white shirts, badges, and guns, think before you tell a police story. But I told it anyway, got a pretty good reaction. Thing's over, I'm feeling pretty good about it, I'm packing up my stuff. Guy comes up with his head down like this and he says, "Thanks for personalizing the presentation." I said, "What?" He said, "I did those wiretaps." So I said, "Well, you've got an exemption named after you, I guess, in the FY. I know. Take a look at them, have some idea what they are, so that when people come in and ask for records, you have some idea."
And I maybe address this later, but we should also talk about public records generally. I used to work with a police chief who, unbeknownst to me, had a set of separate files in his desk. And a request came in, and he says, I don't know what you're complaining about, I've given out all the public records on this matter, except for my personal files. I said, whoa, time out. Personal files? Well, yeah, in my desk, I keep personal files on individuals. I said, I'm thinking, J. Edgar Hoover is not dead.
Yeah.
So I said, Chief, what do you mean by that? Well, the stuff that I don't necessarily want the public to see, I just put it in my desk. You know, like, okay.
Everything, it goes back to the first thing I said, everything's a public record. And you raise a point that I didn't stress, it's everything. Oh, I'm working at home, so it's not a public record. I'm using my own tablet or my own laptop. If you've created it in the conduct of the public's business, it's a public record, and it's something that you ultimately might have to disclose.
The
Yes.
commission's got to look at the content of that record.
Right.
and determine-
Not where you were when you created
Not where
it.
it sits, not if it's on your wife's iPad or whatever.
Right.
What about drafts of documents?
Okay, one of the, you notice that I didn't bring that exemption up because it's one of the most difficult ones to try to describe. The reason is that one person's draft is another person's final copy. There is an exemption for drafts that are preliminary and preliminary notes as well. If it is truly a draft, folks, if it is something that is truly in the stages of being, formulated, subject to serious revisions, then yes, it's a draft. And yes, you are allowed to withhold it. This is particularly, sometimes media will look for something that's not done yet. And I get that as a former media person. We want it and we want it now. We have deadlines to meet. But if it's not done, if it's truly not done, you don't have to release it. The exemption holds. However, a contract that is approved by a Board of Education and a union and signed by them and is awaiting approval by the Board of Selectmen is not a draft. Many people say, well, it's still a draft, we're not going to give it out. So you have to know where the line is on the draft exemption.
What about town hire as a consultant to look at reorganization of town departments, and the consultant puts together a recommendation and stamps all over it draft. Every page says draft, not to be disclosed, and gives it to the person who's responsible for carrying that. Is that vendor's draft report subject to the draft exemption?
Again, I think, Bob, I've seen this before. It depends. If it's just going to be handed over and not changed, then it's not a draft anymore. But if the person in charge or the board in charge is going to rip it apart and say, we don't want this, we don't want that, you can make a case that it has to be, it depends on how much revision is going to go into it. And that's the best answer I can give. It really, it's another one of those that's a case-by-case basis. Remember, we talked about, the emails, texts, and all those things. You're thinking a benign situation with a text, right? This case just within the last year. A first selectman in a town that will remain unnamed won a contest for a giant pumpkin at a fair. He had a picture of that pumpkin on his town-owned phone. He was very proud of it. His secretary, who he doesn't get along with very well, wants to see a picture of the pumpkin. He hands her the phone, and then she starts scrolling through and sees on there a text exchange between him and someone else about how the secretary is having an affair with a married guy.
Oops.
Oops. And the married guy and the secretary make requests for the text. He doesn't want to give them out. It's private. Well, it's not private. Just like the email from Hartford. So you just want to think, folks. You want to think that everything's public. Yes, some of it might not get out, but just think of it in those terms. Are there any? I'm looking at the clock, and we promised we wouldn't be here, all morning. Are there any other questions about anything we haven't touched on? Anything that you want to ask about? Then you know everything there is to know about freedom of information. You've been here for 90 minutes. Remember that we are there to try to help. We spend a lot of time answering questions on the phone. Never, ever hesitate to call. We will respond. I brought a few parting gifts. I call these the Freedom of Information American Express cards. Don't leave home without them. They are highlights of the FOI Act. They're great for a wallet, a purse, a desk drawer. They have our address on the back, our phone numbers on the back. Ring me up, ask for Tom, we'll answer whatever questions you have. Save Bob the agony. I also brought these. These are pretty helpful for meetings. It's a grid.
That's a good.
It shows you when to notice, where not to notice, things like that. Grab those, make copies, and give them to your boards. Do you have anything else?
Just a couple things.
Yes.
Thank you, Tom.
Sure.
Simsbury, I think, enjoys a good relationship with the FOI Commission because we've tried to establish over the years, Tom and myself and others, that we take freedom of information very seriously. And the law is meetings need to be public, and the 3 steps to follow for a meeting need to be followed in every instance, and documents are public with certain exceptions, but the rule is they're public. So when you get a request it's and you work in Simsbury department somewhere, the best thing to do is let Tom know. And then put together, Tom has a very nice, polite response letter that says we'll respond promptly and get that out. We try to get it out within a day or 2. And we don't care who the requester is. As Tom has said it many times, we are blind to who the requester may or may not be. And then we'll follow it through. We have an excellent working relationship with Tom in his office. If we have a question, we call up, and Tom says, Bob, you don't have a leg to stand on there. That exemption doesn't apply. It doesn't apply. Because if you've ever gone to the FOI Commission on a complaint, and we have, because there have been some issues that we feel important are to stand by for the town, you're gonna be in a windowless room for no less than 2 to 2.5 hours stating your case. And then, about 2 months later, you're going to be back in that windowless room when the commission takes it up. It's very time intensive, and it takes a lot of work, and it's work that in 99% of the cases can be avoided, because we've had cases where we declined a request, we've had a complaint, but we continue the dialogue through the ombudsman process, and we work it out. And sometimes we say, well, okay, we get it. Maybe we were too aggressive with that. Come in, look at the document. Or we stand by our guns, and the requester says, well, now I understand. So in every case, when you get an FOI request, don't consider it an adversarial request. It's not adversarial. It's a citizen of the town, of the state, of the country who's exercising their legal rights under the statute, and we take that exercise of the rights very, very seriously, and we follow it through, and hopefully we avoid problems with that. And thank you. It's so great to have Tom work for the FOI, because the commission works so well because people like Tom work for it, and everybody's needs are met through that process.
Before I thank these guys and excuse them, I've just one more thing I want to emphasize. It really doesn't go to the FOI issues we've been talking about, but it does go to the use of email. Email, I think, is one of, when it comes to town liability, but also just in general, it's bad. It's just bad. I've had to, in my prior life, I had to settle cases that were otherwise winnable cases because people got frustrated. And instead of picking up the phone and saying, you know what this guy's done, I think, I've had it with him, that shows up in an email. In this particular case, it happened to be a union steward, and it meant that I had to settle an unfair labor practice charge, which otherwise was completely winnable. Email is a bad forum for working out issues. It's if you're on a board and a commission and you're trying to talk to other commissioners, we know that that's already an illegal meeting. We've just been talking about that. But the reality is that most things are much better worked out, particularly at the staff level, by face-to-face communication. It's both better and it's also leaves you with a better record. So that's just a personal plea that as you're sitting there, remember that the audience that's going to see that email, as the council in Hartford apparently forgot, is potentially a whole lot larger than the audience you want to see it. So it's a great way to send a document, and it's a great way to ask for an appointment, and it's a great way to arrange a meeting. But for working out the guts of something difficult, it's really not a good place to be. It's a bad place to be expressing opinions. So that's just an appeal. I do want to thank Tom Hennick for a wonderful and very, very thorough presentation in the time we had on FOI. And Bob DiCrescenzo, thank you very much for coming and for adding to this. Both of these guys are enormously helpful on this issue. There's never any reason to fly blind on a Freedom of Information Act issue. You're really going to get the best advice you possibly can from Tom, and if you follow it, the chances are 99.9. I mean, there are gray areas, but you're going to be okay. So thank you both very much. Please take, everyone should take these things, and if you didn't sign in when you came through the door, please sign in just so we have a record of who is here. Thanks very much.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.